My name is Elena, and I'm 46 years old. I live a quiet, unassuming life in a small, sunlit apartment on the edge of a city. My days are predictable, measured in cups of tea and the comforting hum of the radio. I work as a freelance editor, spending hours immersed in other people's stories while my own remains for the most part unwritten. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when my life felt vibrant, full of love and possibilities. But the years have a way of dulling the edges, and after my husband passed and my children grew up and moved away, I settled into a routine. Safe, steady, quiet. That is, until last Thursday. I remember the day vividly. It was warm for October, the kind of day that lures you outside with its golden light and crisp breeze. I decided to treat myself to a coffee at my favorite little café. It's a charming spot with mismatched chairs and a wall of books no one ever reads, the kind of place where time feels slower. I had just found a seat by the window when I saw him. He walked in with a confidence that seemed effortless, his dark hair slightly tousled, and a smile that lingered even when he wasn't speaking. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, a lifetime away from me. But something about him caught my attention. I watched as he ordered a coffee, his voice low but warm as he spoke to the barista. He carried himself with an ease that made him stand out, and when he turned, his eyes swept the room before landing on me for the briefest of moments. It was nothing, just a glance, but it sent a ripple through me. I can't explain it. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was. It was something deeper, a magnetic pull that left me unable to look away. I felt a flutter in my chest, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. I should have dismissed it as a passing moment, a silly infatuation. But instead I found myself following him. Not out of malice or obsession. At least, that's what I told myself, but out of sheer curiosity. Over the next 3 days, I began to notice him in places I hadn't expected. At the park where I sometimes went to read, at the grocery store, studying a shelf of spices with the same intensity I'd seen at the café, and again, at the corner bakery, where he lingered over a pastry display as if deciding was the most important choice of the day. I told myself it was coincidence, but deep down I knew better. I was seeking him out, drawn to his presence like a moth to light. I didn't know why, and I didn't know what I hoped to find. What I did know was that, for the first time in years, I felt alive to be why the third day I'd begun to wonder if I was losing my mind. Following a stranger, a much younger one no less, was something I would have scolded my younger self for even entertaining. But there I was, sitting on a park bench, pretending to read while my eyes followed him from a careful distance. He had a habit of sitting in the same spot under a sprawling oak tree, headphones in his ears, a notebook balanced on his knee. I couldn't tell if he was sketching or writing, but the sight of his furrowed brow and the slight curve of his lips when he paused to think captivated me. On this particular day, something shifted. As he stood to leave, he glanced in my direction, and this time, the glance lingered. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than before, a soft, curious look that sent a rush of heat to my cheeks. I quickly dropped my gaze, pretending to fidget with the pages of my book. Was it just a coincidence? I asked myself, but then it happened again. At the grocery store that evening, I was examining a row of teas when I felt it, that faint, inexplicable sensation of being watched. I turned my head, and there he was, a few alls over, holding a jar of honey and smiling, just faintly, when our eyes met. My heart skipped, and I clutched the tea tin in my hand as though it might steady me. He didn't look away. Instead, he gave a small nod, acknowledging me without a word, and walked away. The next morning, as I entered the café where I'd first seen him, I noticed him almost immediately. He was sitting near the window this time, a cup of coffee in one hand and his notebook in the other. I hesitated at the door, unsure if I should turn around and leave, but then something remarkable happened. He looked up, as if sensing me before I'd even moved, and smiled. Not just a polite smile, but one that felt warm, personal, as though he had been expecting me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Did he recognize me? Did he notice I'd been watching him these past few days? But instead of looking away, he gestured toward the chair across from him. It was a subtle motion, but it was unmistakable. He was inviting me to join him. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to retreat, to walk away and pretend this had all been an accident. But something deeper, a quiet, insistent voice inside me, urged me to take a step forward. And so I did. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I walked to his table, unsure of what I would say or what this moment might lead to. But as I sat down, I couldn't help but feel that this was no longer a coincidence. It was fate. I don't know how long we sat there that day, the world outside fading into a blur of soft light and muffled sounds. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised me. His name was Damien, and he spoke with a quiet confidence that drew me in. He shared bits of his life, a passion for art, a love for wandering new cities, and listened intently as I spoke about mine. I was cautious at first, my words carefully measured, but Damien had a way of making me feel seen. Not as a middle-aged woman weighed down by her past, but as a person with stories worth telling. When he leaned in, elbows on the table, and asked, "So, what's your favorite book?" I laughed, caught off guard by his genuine interest. And when I told him, his eyes lit up in a way that made me feel like I'd given the perfect answer. As the café emptied and the shadows grew longer, I realized I didn't want the moment to end. It was a terrifying realization, one that left me grappling with emotions I hadn't felt in years. Hope, longing, and the faint flicker of courage. "Would you like to come over for dinner sometime?" I asked suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My voice trembled, betraying the storm of nerves beneath my calm exterior. Damien blinked, caught off guard, and for a brief moment, I feared I'd made a mistake. But then he smiled, warm and sincere. "I'd love that," he said, and the relief that washed over me was almost dizzying. We agreed on Friday, just 2 days away, and as I walked home that evening, I felt like I was floating. But as the excitement faded, it was quickly replaced by doubt. What was I thinking, inviting him over? Would he regret saying yes? Would he see my age, my wrinkles, my imperfections, and wonder what he was doing with someone like me? I spent the next 2 days oscillating between excitement and panic. I cleaned my apartment until it sparkled, rearranged furniture that didn't need rearranging, and debated over the menu more times than I could count. By the time Friday evening arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. I'd chosen a simple dress that made me feel confident without trying too hard, and as I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of sauce, I heard the doorbell ring. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and opened it to find Damien standing there, a bottle of wine in hand and that same easy smile on his face. "You look beautiful," he said softly, and for the first time in years I believed it. "Come in," I managed to say, stepping aside to let him in. My heart was racing, my palms were damp, but as he entered my home, something inside me shifted. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and yearning for in equal measure. And as I led him to the dining table, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, I'd made the right choice. Dinner passed in a haze of laughter and conversation, the nervous energy that had gripped me earlier slowly melting away. Damien had a way of putting me at ease, his humor light and disarming, his presence grounding yet electric. We talked about everything, his love for painting, my work as an editor, the quirks of living in this city. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so connected to someone, so utterly absorbed in a moment that the rest of the world seemed to fade away. After dinner, we moved to the living room, wine glasses in hand. The dim glow of a table lamp bathed the room in a warm, golden light, and soft music played in the background. I was hyper-aware of how close he was as we sat on the couch, his knee almost brushing against mine. I tried to focus on what he was saying, but my thoughts were a tangle of fear and anticipation. Every glance he gave me, every fleeting touch of his hand, sent my pulse racing. I hadn't felt this way in years, this raw, unguarded intensity. At some point, the conversation lulled, and the silence that followed was heavy-charged. Damien turned to me, his gaze searching, and I felt my breath hitch. "You're amazing, you know that," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart ache. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "I think you might be the first person to say that in a very long time." He smiled, a gentle, almost wistful expression, and reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so intimate, so tender, that it left me completely undone. "Elena," he murmured, and the way he said my name felt like a question and an answer all at once. Before I could overthink it, before the doubts could creep back in, I leaned forward and closed the distance between us. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, as if we were testing the waters. But then something shifted, and the world seemed to fall away. His hands cupped my face, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrender to the moment to him. I don't know how long we stayed like that, wrapped in each other, lost in a connection that felt both impossible and inevitable. Time seemed to stretch and blur, every touch, every breath, searing itself into my memory. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his eyes half-lidded and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. I nodded, unable to form words, my chest tight with emotion. This was more than I'd ever expected, more than I thought I deserved. And yet here he was, looking at me like I was the only thing that mattered. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about desire or attraction. This was something deeper, something I hadn't dared to hope for in years. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. After that night, everything seemed to change. The world outside my apartment felt distant, like I was living in a bubble that existed just for the two of us. Damien became a constant in my thoughts, his smile, his touch, replaying over and over in my mind. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so alive, so seen, so desired. I'll admit, I spent a lot of time questioning what this all meant. What was I doing? What were we doing? The doubts crept in. Could it really work between us, with the years that lay between us, the differences in our lives and experiences? Could I keep up with his energy, his youth, his future while I stood at the crossroads of my past? But as the days passed, something inside me grew more certain. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, a reckless desire, it was real. It was undeniable. I was rediscovering parts of myself I had buried under years of routine and safety. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was living, not just existing. One evening, as we sat together on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Damien turned to me, his expression serious but tender. "Elena," he said, taking my hand in his. "I know we're from different worlds, and I know this might seem crazy, but I don't want to run from it. I don't want to question it. I just want to be with you." His words settled in my chest like a sweet, comforting weight, and I found myself smiling, the warmth of his confession wrapping around me. "I don't want to run either," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm not ready to let this go. Not yet." And that was enough for both of us. For that moment, for the beginning of something neither of us had expected but both deeply needed. In the days and weeks that followed, we embraced each other fully. Our differences, our complexities, the gap in our ages, and the deep connection that neither of us had anticipated. There were moments of uncertainty, sure, moments when I questioned what people would think, or how long this would last. But each time I looked into his eyes, I knew that none of that mattered. What mattered was what we had together. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. I had discovered something beautiful in the most unexpected of places, a love that defied time, defied convention, and reminded me that there's no age limit on happiness. This was my second chance, the one I never saw coming, the one that had found me when I least expected it. And in that moment, I realized that love isn't bound by age or expectations. It's bound only by the courage to follow your heart, wherever it may lead. And so, with Damien by my side, I embraced this new chapter of my life, one filled with more passion, more depth, and more understanding than I ever thought possible. I had rediscovered myself, not just as a woman of a certain age, but as someone who was worthy of love, of joy, and of all the unexpected beauty life still had to offer. As I sit here now, looking back on everything, I can hardly believe it's only been a few months since that first fateful meeting at the café. It feels like a lifetime ago, a different chapter in the book of my life. The woman I was then, cautious, uncertain, wrapped in layers of self-doubt, is not the woman I am today. Damien changed me, not in the way a lover does in stories, where they come in and sweep you off your feet, but in a quieter, more profound way. He reminded me of who I was before time and responsibility, and fear had started to shape me into someone else. There's something liberating about letting go of societal expectations. There was a time when I might have believed that age would make me invisible, that the kind of love I'd once known was something reserved for younger, more idealistic versions of myself. But the truth, as I've learned, is that love isn't confined to age, and neither is the capacity for joy or growth. I found myself again, no longer just a mother, a professional, a widow, but a woman who still has the capacity for passion, for desire, for something so wild and beautiful it can only be called love. I don't know what the future holds for Damien and me. I don't know how long this chapter will last, but what I do know is that I'm no longer afraid of time. I've learned to embrace it, to let it unfold without trying to control it. Because love, in its truest form, doesn't fit neatly into any box. It doesn't follow rules or timelines, it just is. What we share is not perfect, but it's real. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's all you need to make sense of the pieces that once seemed broken. As I look at the man beside me, who still makes my heart skip with a single look, I realize that I have lived through more than I ever thought possible, and yet, there's still so much left to discover. This is my story, and it's just beginning.